I was 36 years old when I went to the moon. I landed on the moon. I think all of the Apollo astronauts, at some degree or other, had this problem.
There is a photograph sitting on the moon right now. It shows a family, a father, a mother, 2 young boys. Everyone is smiling. It is laminated, sealed inside plastic to survive the radiation, the vacuum, the temperature swings of 250 degrees. Whoever placed it there understood it would never be retrieved. On the back in handwriting, someone wrote, "This is the family of astronaut Charlie Duke from planet Earth, landed on the moon, April 21st, 1972. That photograph is still there. Yet more than 50 years later, nobody has gone back for it. Not because the technology doesn't exist, not because the mission would be too dangerous or too expensive, not because no one has tried to organize it. There is a specific reason. And Charles Duke, the man who left that photograph there, the youngest human being in history to walk on another world, knows what it is. He's been telling it for decades. But the version he tells in churches and lecture halls and anniversary events is only part of the story. The rest of it lives in budget documents and cancellation memos, and the psychiatric records of a generation of astronauts who came home from the moon and quietly fell apart. The decision to never go back was made before Duke ever launched, before he left his family's faces on the lunar surface, before he climbed back up the ladder and sealed the hatch. The door had already been closed. He just didn't know it yet. Duke was 36 years old when he stepped off the ladder of the Orion lunar module onto the Descartes Highlands on April 21st, 1972, the youngest person ever to stand on another world, a record that has never been broken. His heart rate at launch was 144 beats per minute. The surface around him looked like a beach no ocean had ever touched. The regolith, the top layer of ground, is a fine gray powder that had never once been compressed by weight, and it held his boot prints perfectly, clean, precise, pressed in as if the ground were setting cement. The sky above him was absolute black. Not dark blue, not deep gray. Black. The way a screen looks when the power cuts out. Stars were invisible in the solar glare, even though space began inches above his helmet. He could see for miles in every direction. No atmosphere meant no haze, no horizon blur, no soft edges, just the Cayley Plains extending outward, and beyond them are mountains named by geologists who had never left Earth. Duke and Commander John Young spent 71 hours on the surface. They drove a lunar rover across ancient craters, deployed seismic instruments, collected 95 kilograms of rock samples that researchers would analyze for the next half-century. By every operational measure, Apollo 16 was flawless, a triumph. Duke splashed down on April 27, 1972. The handshake, the parade, the history books, and then, as he would later describe it, the silence. The people expected him to come home on fire, euphoric, changed forever in some obvious, legible way. What they got instead was a man who couldn't quite explain what had happened to him, and who spent the next several years trying to locate something. Anything that could hold the same weight as what he'd left behind on that gray, airless plane. He left NASA in 1975. His business ventures failed. His marriage was in crisis. His wife Dottie had been struggling long before the mission. Even Apollo hadn't fixed what was already cracked. "I was 36 years old," Duke would say years later. "My marriage was falling apart. We were steaming toward the rocks of divorce. Had 2 kids. Things were pretty desperate in our house." The man who had walked on the moon was losing everything back on Earth. That story has a resolution, and we'll get to it. But before we do, there's another story running beneath it. One that started not in Duke's living room, but in the halls of the White House. It's 2 years before Apollo 16 launched. NASA's future had already been decided, and the people making those decisions had never once left the ground. There's a detail from this period that rarely makes it into the anniversary coverage. It's not dramatic. There's no explosion, no near miss, no photograph of a famous moment. It's a budget line, and it changed everything. On September 2nd, 1970, 19 months before Charles Duke ever set foot on the moon, NASA announced it was canceling Apollo missions 18 and 19. No outcry, no congressional hearings that changed anything. The announcement came in bureaucratic language, the kind that buries devastation in passive voice. Budgetary constraints, resource reallocation, prioritization of future programs. Apollo 20 had already been canceled 8 months earlier, in January. So by September 1970, the 3 planned moon missions were simply gone. The sites had been chosen, the science objectives written. Gassendi Crater, Copernicus, Tycho, gone. The men who had trained for those missions knew. Astronaut Bill Pogue, who was in line for one of the canceled flights, later described receiving the news as a hammer blow, even though, as he put it, people had been reading between the lines for months. Astronaut Dick Gordon had been warned by a colleague to shift focus to Skylab. He refused, all holding out hope for a moon landing of his own. He never got one. This is the detail that doesn't fit the triumphant version of the Apollo story. The cancellations came while men were still in training, while they were still suiting up, still running simulations, still studying lunar geology for destinations they would never reach. And there's something beneath the cancellations that goes even deeper. In 1968, before a single crewed Saturn V had ever flown, NASA Administrator James Webb refused to fund the production line beyond the 15 rockets already contracted. No more would be built. The decision was made before the first moon landing, before the American public had any idea what was coming. By the time Duke stood on the Descartes Highlands in April 1972, Saturn V production had been shut down for 4 years. The machines that could have built new rockets no longer existed. The engineers who knew how to build them had scattered. Yes, going back to the moon wouldn't just require money, it would require starting over from the beginning. And no one in Washington was willing to say that out loud. The official reason was cost. Vietnam was consuming the federal budget. The Soviet moon program had collapsed after its own rocket failures. The race was over. The political will had evaporated. But cost alone doesn't explain the silence. It doesn't explain what came next. The researchers who have gone back through the internal records describe a period of institutional shock inside NASA that was never discussed publicly. Nobody was allowed to grieve in the press releases. This is the part that tends to get left out. In August 1971, President Nixon proposed canceling the 2 remaining lunar landing missions, Apollo 16 and Apollo 17. Both of them gone. Duke was in training. He was 9 months from his launch date. He had been preparing for years. Nixon's Office of Management and Budget pushed back, not because of the science, not because of the astronauts, but because of the optics. A White House deputy director named Caspar Weinberger argued against it, writing to Nixon that canceling the remaining moon missions would signal that the United States was a second-rate nation. Nixon kept the missions, but only just. The memo that preserved Duke's flight also recommended that if the cancellations did happen, they should be announced on the grounds that Apollo 15 had been so successful in gathering needed data that we can now shift, sooner than previously expected, to the space shuttle. Read that again. The space shuttle. The vehicle that would replace the moon program was already the plan. It just needed a justification. And the justification was the moon was already done. Duke launched in April 1972, a mission that Nixon had wanted to cancel, using hardware from a production line that had been shut down 4 years earlier, as part of a program that the White House was already treating as a completed chapter. The history books call Apollo 16 a triumph. It was also an ending disguised as a mission. If you're finding this story more layered than you expected, a like genuinely helps this channel keep digging into stories like this one. There is a pattern among the astronauts who actually walked on the moon, yet it was not discussed publicly. It did not appear in the mission reports or the press releases, but it was real, and it was documented in the years that followed. Buzz Aldrin returned from the first moon landing and fell apart. He's been open about it. The alcoholism, the hospitalizations, the years of depression. I had reached the pinnacle, he said in one documented interview. And there was no more. He described his life after the moon as a valley he couldn't find a way out of. A man who had done the single greatest thing a human being had done, and who now had nowhere left to go. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14, came home from the moon and became convinced that human consciousness was more than science could explain. He founded an institute dedicated to studying what he called noetic science, the inner knowing that goes beyond rational thought. Yet he spent the rest of his career in territory that mainstream researchers wouldn't touch. Alan Bean, Apollo 12, quit NASA and became a painter. He spent decades trying to recreate on canvas what the moon had looked like, because he couldn't find any other way to stay connected to it. He mixed lunar dust from his mission suit into his paints. He wanted the moon on every surface he touched. And Charles Duke left NASA in 1975, and as he has described it, spent the next several years adrift. Business failures, marital fracture. His wife Dottie, who had already been struggling before the mission, later revealed that during the darkest period, she had contemplated suicide. She had hoped that when Duke's NASA career ended, she would finally come first. Instead, he came home from the moon and went looking for the next peak, and there wasn't one. "How do you top a flight to the moon?" Duke asked in one interview. "Shall I climb to the top of the ladder? The data doesn't care about our comfort." 12 men walked on the moon. Of those 12, an unmistakable number underwent profound psychological ruptures within 5 years of their return. Aldrin's alcoholism, Mitchell's paradigm shift, Bean's retreat into art, Duke's near divorce, and spiritual unmooring. These were not weak men. They were the most rigorously selected, most psychologically screened, most technically capable human beings their culture had ever produced. And the moon broke something in most of them. NASA had no framework for that. It was not in the mission debrief. There was no protocol, no department, no official acknowledgement that returning from another world might cost a person something they couldn't put back. The psychological fallout of the Apollo program is part of the reason it ended, not because anyone said so, but because the silence around it was loud enough. The team sits with the data for a moment. Nobody quite knows how to categorize it. It doesn't fit into any existing category of mission risk. There is a version of this story that circulates online with regularity. It claims the real reason we stopped going to the moon is that the astronauts found something up there. A structure, an encounter, a warning. Something that scared NASA into silence. It gets millions of views every time it resurfaces. Fact checkers have addressed it thoroughly. And they're right. There is no credible evidence for any version of that claim. The lunar samples brought back by Apollo astronauts have been studied by independent labs across multiple countries. The findings are consistent. The moon is a geologically inactive, atmosphereless body shaped by impacts and ancient lava flows. Nothing else has been found. But here's what's worth examining. Why does that story keep coming back? The people who share it are not, for the most part, deeply invested in extraterrestrial theories. They are people who sense that the official explanation, budget cuts, doesn't fully account for the permanence of the decision. And they're right to sense that, not because there's a cover-up, but because the official explanation leaves too much out. Nations don't abandon the greatest achievement in their history because of a line item. They don't shut down a production line that took a decade to build. You dismantle the institutional structure that employed 400,000 people, retire the most powerful rocket ever flown, and pivot to a vehicle that would never leave Earth's orbit, all within 2 years of reaching the moon, just because the accounting got uncomfortable. What those online theories are pointing at, without quite finding it, is the institutional collapse that followed the landings, the loss of mission. The fact that the political and psychological infrastructure that built Apollo simply didn't survive contact with its own success. The moon was the goal. Once it was reached, no one had an answer for what came after. Not in Washington, not at NASA, not for many agonizing years in the lives of the men who had gone there. The hardware ended up on its side in a field in Florida. The men came home and rebuilt themselves as best they could, and the world moved on remarkably fast. Step back from the budget lines and the canceled mission numbers for a moment. There is a harder question underneath all of this, and the evidence, the pattern of astronaut testimony, the decades of reflection, Duke's own words, keeps pointing toward it. What did the moon actually do to those men? Here, researchers who have studied astronaut testimony systematically, interviewing returning crew members across multiple programs and multiple decades, describe a cognitive shift that a significant number of astronauts report after seeing Earth from space. They've called it the overview effect. It's documented, not mystical, not anecdotal. From Earth orbit, the planet fills your vision. It's large, detailed, present. From the moon, it is a marble. It hangs in absolute black, in no bigger than a thumbnail held at arm's length. Every human being who ever lived, every war ever fought, every civilization ever built, compressed into a sphere you could cover with your hand. Duke has described looking at Earth from the Descartes highlands and feeling protective of it. Not proud, not awed, protective, as if the distance reversed something. As if seeing his entire species from 240,000 miles made him responsible for it in a way he hadn't felt before. That feeling, according to accounts from multiple Apollo astronauts, did not go away when they landed. It persisted, and it didn't fit. It didn't fit the Cold War framework that had funded the space race. It didn't fit the career structure waiting for them when they touched down. It didn't fit the culture of 1972, which was busy with Vietnam and Watergate and the accelerating fracture of the certainties that had sent 12 men to the moon in the first place. Yet the Apollo program was built on a specific American mythology, the belief that human will, applied with sufficient resources and discipline, could accomplish anything. That the moon was a problem to be solved, and solved it would be. That mythology began collapsing in 1972. The same year Duke walked on the moon. The same year Nixon was re-elected on a platform that included winding down the space program. The same year the Watergate break-in occurred. And the same year the Vietnam War's true shape became undeniable. Some scholars who have studied the cultural history of the space age argue, and this is a contested interpretation, but not one that's easy to dismiss, that the moon program was always as much about what America needed to believe about itself as it was about science or exploration. It was proof of national will. And when that proof no longer needed proving, the program became expendable. Yet the men who came back from the moon arrived in a country that had already moved on, and many of them spent years trying to understand why everything they had achieved felt, in the end, not like a beginning, but like a conclusion. Duke found his answer eventually. He became a committed Christian in 1978. He has spoken about it openly for decades. The walk on the moon lasted 3 days, he has said. The walk with Jesus lasts forever. He's not hedging, he means it. And the moon showed him something he couldn't explain, and faith gave him a framework for living inside the unexplained. Whether or not you share his faith, his testimony contains something worth sitting with. He went to the moon. He was 36 years old. He was the youngest human being to stand on another world. And when he came home, the thing he had just done was not enough. Not enough to save his marriage. Not enough to fill the silence. Not enough to answer the question that every returning astronaut carries back with them, unspoken, in the chest. Now what? NASA has never publicly answered that question. It's an engineering organization. It builds rockets. It runs missions. It doesn't have a department for the philosophical aftermath. If we follow the evidence to its honest conclusion, what ended the Apollo program was not just Nixon's budget, not just the cancellation memos, not just the closed production lines. It was the absence of a reason to go back that was larger than the reason that sent them in the first place. The Cold War gave NASA a mission. Once that mission was accomplished, no one in Washington had a vision large enough to replace it. The moon was never the destination. It was a proxy for something else. Something about human possibility, about what we were capable of when we decided to reach. When we stopped reaching, we called it fiscal responsibility. Yeah, and Charles Duke is 88 years old. People who have encountered him at speaking events in recent years, at aerospace conferences, at churches in Texas, at anniversary gatherings for the Apollo program, describe a man who is warm and unhurried. He shakes every hand. He answers every question, including the hard ones. At a school visit a few years ago, he spent 20 minutes with a group of middle schoolers who had been studying the moon landings. He answered every question they asked. And when one of them asked why we stopped going, he paused. Then he said, "That's the right question. I've thought about it for 50 years. That pause carries weight, not because he doesn't have an answer, because the full answer, the honest one, the one that includes everything, the canceled missions, the closed production lines, the broken marriages, yet the astronauts who came home and fell apart, still costs something to say out loud in a room full of children who only know the triumphant version. The photograph is still on the moon, the Descartes Highlands, 50 years of lunar days and nights cycling over it. cosmic radiation that would destroy unprotected electronics within weeks, temperature swings that crack metal. The laminate may have degraded by now. The image inside it may be gone, but the fact of it remains. A man left evidence of the people he loved on another world. He wrote their names in his handwriting on the back. He walked away. He climbed back up the ladder. He sealed the hatch. And he never had the chance to go back. Not because he didn't want to, but because by the time he left that photograph on the surface, the decision had already been made. The Saturn V that could have taken him back was lying on its side in Florida. Yet the production line that could have built another one had been closed 4 years earlier. The White House had already written the press release framing the space shuttle as the future and the moon as the past. He left his family's faces in the dust of another world. The program that put them there had been quietly canceled around him. The mission was already over before it began. And that is not the story NASA ever told, not officially, not in the anniversary documentaries. So, not in the press releases that called Apollo 16 a triumph, which it was, in every technical sense. But triumph and abandonment are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes they are the same moment seen from different distances. So here's the question the evidence actually leaves us with. When Duke placed that photograph on the moon, was he leaving it as a promise? Proof that humans had been there and would return? Or was he already, without quite knowing it, leaving it as a memorial? A marker for something that had already ended? There are two ways to hold everything we now know. The first, the Apollo program was ended by political cowardice and short-term calculation at the exact moment it had built the capability to go further. The rockets existed. The sites were chosen. The science was ready. 3 missions were canceled not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient. And the men who paid the psychological price for those decisions were left to work through it alone, without acknowledgement, without language, without a framework from the institution that sent them. The second, the moon broke something in the human beings who went there. Not in a mystical sense, in a documented, real, psychological sense. The overview effect is not speculation. The pattern of astronaut rupture is not coincidence. And maybe what those men experienced was a signal. Yet maybe we were not yet ready to understand what the moon was showing us about ourselves. Our smallness, our fragility, the arbitrary borders we had drawn across that pale blue marble, and the culture we came back to wasn't equipped to receive it. Duke has his answer. He's been clear about it for 40 years, but the photograph is still there, and the question it raises has never been resolved. Were we a civilization that turned back too soon, the greatest explorers in human history? He stopped by budget lines and political calculus at the edge of something vast? Or were we something we hadn't yet named, still becoming what we needed to be before we deserved to go further? If that question stays with you, share this with someone who needs to hear it. The answer belongs to all of us.